Most people who remember Boblo Island will tell you the park closed because the world changed around it. They'll say it couldn't compete with Cedar Point, or that the boats got too expensive, or that Detroit just wasn't what it used to be, and all of that is true in a way. But the real story of how a 95-year-old amusement park disappears is stranger and more tangled than any single explanation. It involves a bounced check for $250,000, a Minneapolis entertainment company that also happened to own the Harlem Globetrotters, a man who broke his spine in a car accident the same month the park played its final season, and a hand-carved wooden carousel that was auctioned off horse by horse while the park was still technically open. The end of Boblo Island wasn't one decision. It was 100 small failures that only look inevitable in hindsight. But before any of that, there was the river. The Detroit River runs roughly 18 miles from the city of Detroit south toward Lake Erie, and about 3 miles before it empties into the lake, there is an island. It is half a mile wide and 3 miles long, shaped a little like a canoe, and for centuries the birch and poplar trees lining its banks gave it a pale, almost glowing appearance from the water. The Wyandot people who lived there called it Etiohuitendanenti, which translates to whitewood. French missionaries who arrived in the 18th century called it Bois Blanc for the same reason. English-speaking settlers who came later couldn't pronounce it properly and mangled the French into something close to Boblo, and eventually the name stuck. It would not become official until 1949, but long before that, it was the only name most people in Detroit or Windsor ever used. The island had already lived several lives before anyone thought to build an amusement park on it. It sits in the Detroit River on the Canadian side of the border, about 274 acres in total, part of the municipality of Amherstburg, Ontario. In 1718, the earliest written records describe 70 Native American families farming the fertile soil. By 1742, a French mission was established among the Huron. After 1796, the British took control, and they built 3 blockhouses and a stone lighthouse on the southern tip, using the island as a defensive outpost for nearby Fort Malden in Amherstburg. The lighthouse, constructed of local limestone in 1836, marked the beginning of the Detroit River Navigation Channel for ships traveling upriver from Lake Erie. During the War of 1812, a combined British and native force launched from the island in canoes, surprising and capturing an American vessel bound for Detroit. It was the first local military action of the war. That blockhouse, one of the 3 originals, would still be standing nearly 2 centuries later, long after the last roller coaster had been hauled away for scrap, tucked among residential lots like a relic from someone else's story. During the mid-19th century, private owners bought parcels and built cottages, stables, and riding trails. The island's middle section was slowly cleared and developed, though private cottages and government property remained at the north and south ends. It was a place people came to for the air and the quiet, not for anything resembling entertainment. In 1898, the Detroit, Belle Isle, and Windsor Ferry Company decided to do something with its weekends. The company had been incorporated in 1881 to provide ferry service between Detroit, Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit's Belle Isle Park. It was already busy during the work week, shuttling passengers and goods up and down the river, but Saturdays and Sundays were slow. They leased a section of Bois Blanc Island and turned it into a recreation park. There were picnic grounds, scenic gardens, baseball diamonds, bicycle tracks, and a place to swim. It was modest, the kind of place you'd take a church group on a warm Saturday. But it worked, because the journey itself was half the draw. The ferry ride from downtown Detroit covered about 18 miles and took roughly 90 minutes each way. And there was something about that passage down the river, the city shrinking behind you, the industrial shoreline giving way to marshland and trees, the green line of the island growing closer, that made the destination feel earned. Visitors arriving at the island dock stepped out of a covered passageway and saw ahead of them the park spreading out along the island's cleared middle section, with the old-growth trees framing the edges and the river visible on both sides. By 1901, the ferry company had bought a large portion of the island outright, and because the boats from Detroit were filling up faster every summer, they commissioned a new steamship. The SS Columbia was launched on May 10, 1902, built in Wyandot, Michigan by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company and designed by the naval architect Frank E. Kirby. She was 207 feet long, 60 feet wide, with 5 decks capable of holding more than 2,500 passengers. Kirby designed a novel girder system for the Columbia that allowed for the long, open spans needed for a dance floor. And because of this innovation, the Columbia became the first steamboat in America with a proper ballroom. The interior decorator, Louis O. Keel, fitted the ship with mahogany paneling, leaded glass, and gilded moldings. She was gorgeous. She was also, in the way of early 20th century pleasure boats, both democratic and grand. For the cost of an excursion ticket, a factory worker could spend a summer afternoon dancing on polished wood under cut crystal. 8 years later, in 1910, the company needed another ship. The SS St. Clair was built at the Toledo Shipbuilding Company, again designed by Kirby, slightly smaller than her sister, but no less elegant. She was launched on May 7th, 1910. Together, the Columbia and the St. Clair became the Boblo boats. For a third ship, the SS Britannia had briefly joined the fleet in 1906, but it was the two sisters that endured. They would run the same route down the Detroit River to the island and back for more than 80 years, with only a 2-year pause during the Depression. During peak summers, each ship made the trip carrying close to its full capacity, and the two boats combined moved upward of 500,000 passengers in a single season. At a fare of 85 cents, which was the going rate in the 1940s, the trip was within reach of almost anyone. For working-class families in Detroit, Boblo wasn't a luxury. It was accessible in a way that few comparable experiences were. But the boats were not just transportation. They had their own culture. There were arcades on board, snack bars, live music, the Columbia's ballroom, that unprecedented dance floor made possible by Kirby's innovative girder system, attracted couples and groups who danced the whole 90 minutes downriver. During the 1920s, big band nights drew what were called black and tans, multiracial crowds of young people who came for the dancing. The boats operated in a kind of borderless space, technically making an international crossing from Michigan to Ontario and back, and that liminal quality seemed to loosen things up. The river wasn't Detroit and it wasn't Canada. It was somewhere in between. Visitors from those years often mention the smell of the river water mixed with engine oil, the vibration of the propeller through the lower decks, the way the city skyline shrank and the island appeared, a dark green line widening on the horizon. The park itself, meanwhile, was growing. The first proper amusement ride, a carousel, was installed around 1906. It was built by the famed Coney Island firm of William F. Mangels, with horses and animals hand-carved by Marcus Charles Illions, a Russian immigrant widely considered the greatest carousel carver who ever lived. Illions had arrived in America in 1888 and perfected his craft working in Coney Island workshops. The carousel he produced for Boblo featured 44 horses, 2 goats, and 2 deer, each intricately carved with individual details, no two alike. It would spin on the island for more than 8 decades. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. That carousel, carved by the same hands that produced masterpieces now preserved in museums, turned slowly in the lake breeze on a small Canadian island for 84 years, while generations of children climbed on and off its wooden animals. The same horses, the same goats, the same deer. Year after year, from the age of the horse and buggy through 2 world wars and the space race and the arrival of the personal computer. What happened to it eventually is part of this story, but not yet. In 1913, a dance pavilion was constructed on the island, financed by Henry Ford. It was enormous. At the time it opened, it was the largest dance hall in North America, capable of holding 5,000 dancers at once, and it ranked as the second largest in the world. For years, it was rumored to have been designed by the legendary Detroit architect Albert Kahn, but later research determined the actual designer was John Scott. Inside the pavilion was one of the world's largest orchestrions, a self-playing mechanical orchestra manufactured by the Welta Company in Germany. The instrument stood 16 feet tall and 14 feet wide and contained 419 pipes and its own percussion section. When no live band was scheduled, the orchestrion filled the dance hall with music by itself, An entire orchestra without a single musician, its pipes and drums and cymbals animated by pneumatic mechanisms. The dance hall became a premier concert destination from the 1920s through the 1960s, hosting big bands and drawing crowds that came as much for the music as for the rides. It was built from the same Amherstburg limestone that formed the island's oldest structures. Stone from the era of the blockhouse, repurposed for jazz. The whip ride was installed in 1920, and by the accounts that survive, it was an immediate hit, reportedly paying for itself within a short time. Through the 20s, Boblo was booming. Swimming contests were organized from Belle Isle to the island, a distance of 24 miles through the Detroit River. The best recorded time was 8 hours and 42 minutes, turned in simultaneously by two teenage Detroit girls, Dorothy DeCossin and Ida Mutnick. The park attracted church groups, corporate outings, union picnics, school trips. The Detroit community's biggest annual gathering on the island was sponsored by the St. Stanislaus Parish. Boblo was becoming what Detroiters would later call it, their Coney Island. Then the Depression came, and the island went quiet. Attendance dropped so far that the Columbia and the St. Clair were taken out of service entirely for the 1933 and 1934 seasons. The park shut down. For 2 years, the island sat empty. The rides didn't turn. The dance hall didn't play. The dock that had received hundreds of thousands of visitors a year received none. It was a brief death, as it turned out, but it was a real one. When the boats returned in 1935, smaller vessels began supplementing the route, picking up visitors from Monroe and Toledo for a time. The old Detroit, Belle Isle, and Windsor Ferry Company was renamed the Boblo Excursion Company. The park reopened, and it survived. But something had been proven. Boblo could close. It had closed. The island didn't need the park. The park needed the boats, and the boats needed customers, and customers needed a reason to come, and all of that depended on a fragile chain of choices that could snap. The chain held through World War II. The park actually thrived during the war years, offering an affordable escape for families whose other options were limited by rationing and travel restrictions. But the cross-border nature of the operation created complications. Ferry service from the Canadian shore in Amherstburg was suspended in 1940 due to wartime border regulations and remained closed until 1947, when passport requirements for Canadians visiting the island were finally dropped. The war years also produced a peculiar wrinkle from the First World War that is worth mentioning here, because the park sat on Canadian soil, but was owned and visited almost entirely by Americans. A special arrangement had to be worked out during that earlier conflict. American soldiers on liberty needed to cross into a foreign country to reach the rides, and without a specific legislative exception, visiting the amusement park could technically be classified as leaving the United States. A special bill was passed to allow servicemen to visit Boblo without fear of prosecution for desertion. It is one of those facts that sounds invented, but it appears in multiple historical accounts. During the war years and into the late 1940s, Detroit organizations continued to hold massive annual picnics on the island. Church groups, unions, fraternal organizations, and company outings filled the boats. The largest annual gathering was sponsored by St. Stanislaus Parish, drawing thousands. For the Prohibition era, there had been a fight over getting a beer license for the boats. A figure named Campbell, whose exact role varies in the accounts, had resisted it. After Prohibition's repeal and Campbell's death, the boats were able to serve beer, which helped the bottom line considerably. What happened on June 21st, 1945, also sounds almost too pointed to be true, but it is exhaustively documented. A 24-year-old woman named Sarah Elizabeth Ray had just graduated from secretarial school in Detroit, the only black student in a class of 40. She and about a dozen classmates bought tickets for a celebratory trip to Boblo. They paid 85 cents each and boarded the Columbia. A ticket taker made his rounds. He took the ticket from Ray's hand, looked at her face, and summoned two men in white coats who told her she had to leave the boat. The ferry company maintained a policy excluding, in its own language, zoot suiters, the rowdyish, the rough, the boisterous, and colored. Ray's teacher told her she would go quietly, a remark that Ray later described as adding insult to injury. She was escorted off the ship. Her classmates, all white, sailed without her. The company refunded her 85 cents. She threw the money at the boat. From the Woodward Avenue pier, Ray watched the Columbia steam away. Then she found a payphone and called the NAACP. In her own words, later recalled, "I was always a free soul. I was mad." The case that followed, Boblo Excursion Company versus Michigan, wound through the courts for 3 years. A local recorder's court in Detroit found the company in violation of Michigan's civil rights statute, which guaranteed full and equal accommodations on public conveyances, and fined it $25. According to a December 1945 report in the Chicago Defender, the irate defendant asked the judge what in God's world the civil rights statute sought, to which the judge replied that it sought to see that all God's children had equal rights in Michigan. The company, alarmed less by the fine than by what the ruling implied for its business model, appealed. In that year alone, the 2 Boblo boats had carried some 500,000 passengers, nearly all of them white, to and from the island. A legal mandate granting black Americans equal access would, in the company's view, compromise the entire enterprise. The Michigan Supreme Court upheld the lower court. The company then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that because its boats crossed into Canadian waters, it was engaged in foreign commerce and therefore beyond the reach of Michigan law. The legal team fighting on Ray's behalf included Thurgood Marshall, then head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and not yet a Supreme Court justice himself. The National Lawyers Guild and the American Civil Liberties Union also joined the case. On February 2, 1948, the court ruled against the Boblo Excursion Company, holding that the island was, economically and socially, an amusement adjunct of the city of Detroit, and that Michigan's anti-discrimination laws applied. The ruling came 6 years before Brown v. Board of Education. Ray's stand preceded Rosa Parks by a full decade. And here is the part of Sarah Elizabeth Ray's story that almost nobody knows. After the case, she did not become famous. She did not give speeches or write a memoir. She moved through Detroit quietly. In 1962, she married a Jewish activist named Raphael Haskell and changed her name to Liz Haskell. Following the 1967 Detroit riots, she founded a community center on the east side of the city called Action House, where she tutored children, organized after-school programs, and provided free lunches. She noted the rising tensions left behind by the riots and felt the need to create a space for interracial solidarity. She never spoke publicly about what happened on the Columbia. The people who knew her at Action House had no idea she was the woman from the boat. When researchers finally tracked her down in 2006, just months before her death, a journalist who met her described being completely captivated by her and heartbroken by how thoroughly she had been forgotten. She had very clear memories, the journalist noted, about the day on the Boblo boat that really did start to change history in America. Ray died on August 10, 2006, at the age of 88. Action House was quietly razed a few years later. Her vacant home on Woodlawn Street, still filled with clothing, letters, and keepsakes, nearly met the same fate before it was designated in 2021 as one of the country's 11 most endangered historic sites by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. After the Supreme Court ruling, the Boblo Excursion Company decided not to operate for the 1949 season, a decision that provoked a furious public backlash. Newspaper coverage was extensive and angry. Detroiters had come to see the park as a civic institution, and the idea of an empty Boblo was unacceptable. Windsor's mayor, Arthur John Reaume, proposed that the island be designated a national park, but that idea went nowhere. Fortunately, a Grosse Pointe businessman named Troy H. Browning stepped forward and purchased the operation for $549,000, readying the park for a June 1st opening. It was also in 1949 that the name Boblo was officially adopted for the island, a belated acknowledgement that virtually no one in the region had ever called it Bois Blanc. The Browning Steamship Company took over the ferry service, and the Boblo Company took charge of the island, and the Detroit City Council gave Browning a citation for saving the place. Under the Browning family's ownership, The next 3 decades would be the park's golden age. Troy Browning understood something important about Boblo. It was never going to be Disneyland, and it didn't need to be. It was a day trip, an outing, a reward for surviving the school year. The rides had to be fun, the grounds had to be clean, and the boats had to run on time. From a total of 6 rides in 1946, the park's roster climbed to 27 by 1957. New attractions were imported from Europe. A funhouse appeared. An antique car display drew curious visitors. The Midway filled out. One thing that helped Boblo in the first 2 decades of Browning ownership was the closure of several rival parks in the region. As smaller competitors disappeared, Boblo absorbed their customers. A miniature railroad began circling the island in 1956, a scale replica of the 19th century C.P. Huntington locomotive chugging along 2 miles of track. The 20-minute ride took passengers past the Amherstburg Channel, the picnic grounds, the old blockhouse and lighthouse, the dance pavilion, and the marina. It was a tour of the island's layers, each landmark from a different century, but all visible from the same slow-moving train. The conductor would point out sights along the way, including the Sailor's Monument, the water filtration plant, and the marina where private boats tied up for the afternoon. Summer residents on the north end of the island, who rented cottages for the season, used the train as informal transportation, jumping off at the north end with a wink from the ticket booth attendant who told the conductor to slow down so the girls could hop off safely. The island had a dual personality in those years. It was an amusement park on one end and a small, quiet community of seasonal cottages on the other, and the train stitched them together. In 1952, a former Ringling Brothers circus performer named Joe Short was hired to entertain passengers on the boats. Short was a man of small stature with a large personality. He wore outlandish, colorful outfits and an oversized hat emblazoned with the words, "Captain Bob Lowe." He carried binoculars for what he called navigation purposes and roamed the decks telling knock-knock jokes and adventure stories to children who adored him. Captain Boblo became as much a fixture of the experience as the boats themselves. He worked every season for 22 years, finally retiring in 1974 at the age of 90. After the boats docked at night in Detroit, he was known to continue entertaining at the local bars and taverns he frequented. There was no replacement for Captain Boblo. After 1974, the boats still ran, but they were a little quieter. The super satellite jets arrived in 1957, manufactured in Germany by Caspar Klaus, a rotating ring of rocket-shaped gondolas that let families pretend they were part of the space race. In 1958, the island was the site of an unusual joint Canadian-American military exercise, with amphibious units from around the Great Lakes addressing a simulated hostile force. It is a strange image. Soldiers landing on the same shore where children were eating cotton candy a week earlier. The exercise seems to have been largely forgotten, but it is another reminder that the island existed at the intersection of 2 countries and that its status was never entirely simple. The Swan paddle boats were added in 1970 and immediately became a fan favorite, one of those rides that had no thrill to speak of but an atmosphere all its own. You paddled in slow circles on a man-made pond and watched the park from water level, the sound softened by distance, the coaster rattling faintly on the far side of the Midway. In 1972, a log flume was built, a 1,200-foot water ride with a 40-foot plunge, perfectly calibrated to drench riders on a hot July afternoon. And then in 1973 came the Thunderbolt, a steel roller coaster manufactured by Sansei of Japan, at a cost of $600,000. It had 24 seats arranged in 4 3-bench cars, a 21-meter lift hill, 762 meters of track, and a top speed just under 60 miles an hour. The lines for the Thunderbolt stretched long on summer weekends, and there are people who will tell you that the rattle and climb of that first hill, looking out over the Detroit River from an island that most passengers had reached by steamship, was unlike any coaster experience anywhere else. Accounts differ on whether there was an older wooden roller coaster on the island before the Thunderbolt. Some sources reference a wooden coaster that operated from the late 1930s through the mid-1960s and was removed after an accident. and the steel coaster may have been placed on or near the same site. But the details remain hazy, the kind of park lore that no surviving document quite confirms. Attendance by the early 1960s surged above 600,000 per season. But there was also a more complicated undercurrent. The construction of Hart Plaza in downtown Detroit forced the Columbia and St. Clair to dock away from their traditional downtown berth, disrupting a ritual that had been seamless for decades. It was, in the scheme of things, a small logistical change, but the boats had always departed from a place that felt like the center of the city. Moving the dock moved the starting line. It made the trip slightly less convenient, slightly less natural, and in the economy of summer recreation, small inconveniences compound. There were other pressures. In 1969, Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio, debuted its Blue Streak roller coaster, and the park was beginning a transformation into the thrill ride capital of the Midwest. Boblo's rides were charming, but charm was a hard sell against a park that was adding bigger and faster attractions every year. The Arab oil embargo of the mid-1970s spiked gas prices and crimped recreational travel. The boats consumed an extraordinary share of revenue. One analysis estimated that operating the Columbia and the St. Clair consumed 45% of the park's gross income. And there were safety incidents through the 70s, several accidents on various rides between 1973 and 1978. None involved deaths, but the incidents generated news coverage and raised questions about maintenance standards under the Ontario authorities who had jurisdiction. The park's workforce in those years was almost entirely teenagers. One former ride operator from the 70s described her commute. She would bike from Riverside to a bus stop, ride the bus to the dock, then take the ferry across to the island, a journey of up to 2 hours each way. She did it every day because she loved it that much. Another former employee recalled that working at Boblo was a family tradition, something that ran through generations. Her mother, her aunts, her grandmother, even her great-grandmother had all worked in the cafeteria. A lot of it was teenagers supervising teenagers, as one of them put it. Friday night parties on the island after the park closed were part of the culture. They worked in the sun from early morning until late at night, watching the sunset from the midway. It was the kind of summer job that felt like living inside a story. But even within that warmth, the economics were shifting. Even with one-price admission tickets that were a bargain at $8, attendance in the late 1970s was falling. The aftermath of the 1967 Detroit riots had altered the social geography of the region, and the park found itself needing extra security that hadn't been necessary before. Adding to the complication, the park operated under two countries' jurisdictions simultaneously, Canadian safety regulators and American consumer expectations, which created layers of red tape that a small park couldn't easily navigate. After 30 years of family ownership, Todd Browning sold the park in 1979 to Cambridge Properties of Kentucky for $5 million. The Browning era was over, and what followed was a decade of instability that, in retrospect, looks like a slow-motion unraveling. Cambridge spent another $5 million in improvements, trying to replace the crowds that had slipped away in the late 70s. They added new rides, refurbished existing ones, and introduced a carousel theater, converted from an old roller skating rink, where up to 1,250 people could watch musical revue shows 4 times daily, including a 1950s-themed production with a large Elvis backdrop. A big wheel ride was installed shortly after the purchase. There was energy in the effort, an attempt to rebrand Boblo for a new decade. But Cambridge was operating under enormous financial strain, and within 2 years of acquiring the park, it declared bankruptcy. The pattern of rapid acquisition, followed by financial collapse, was becoming Boblo's defining feature. By 1983, the property was sold again, this time to the Automobile Club of Michigan, AAA, for $6.5 million. The AAA years are one of those periods that people remember as a reprieve. AAA was not a flashy operator, but it was stable, and it invested in the park with a preservationist's instinct. The most significant project was the restoration of the Mangels-Illions carousel, which by then was over 100 years old. Each of the 48 figures and 2 chariots was painstakingly refurbished by the renowned carousel artist Tom Layton at an average of 80 to 100 hours per piece. The carousel's original German-made organ had given way to recorded music over the years, but during the restoration, a new organ was installed. The work was completed in 1987, and for one brief season the carousel looked the way Mangels-Illions might have intended it to look, the paint fresh, the gilding sharp, the horses frozen in mid-gallop with every carved tendril and flowing mane crisp and whole, the screamer, a steel coaster with a double corkscrew and a 75-foot drop reaching speeds of 40 miles per hour, was added in 1985. A year later, the Sky Tower arrived, a 214-foot observation ride originally from Portugal Village in San Pedro, California. Its rotating cabin promised a 20-mile view encompassing Michigan, Ontario, and Ohio. For the first time in years, Boblo felt like it was adding to itself rather than holding on. The park also featured, in those years, the Nightmare, an indoor all-dark ride that visitors either loved or refused to enter. It was one of 3 roller coasters on the island, alongside the Screamer and the Sky Streak, the renamed Thunderbolt. The Wild Mouse, a compact steel coaster known for its sharp turns, was another draw. The scooter boats remained popular, those bumper car-like craft that floated on water, powered by an overhead electric grid rather than the small gas engines used in modern bumper boats. The Falling Star swung riders in a giant pendulum arc. The Enterprise spun them in a vertical loop. The park had a small zoo. It had a midway. It had the kind of atmosphere that was increasingly rare in the era of megaparks, a place where you could walk the whole grounds in an hour and ride everything twice in a day. Kids who visited Boblo in the mid-'80s remember being greeted at the dock by costumed mascots, Bobby the Bear and Louie the Lion, who waved and posed for photos as families streamed off the ferry. And then AAA sold. In 1988, though it was not looking for a buyer, AAA accepted a large, unsolicited offer from the International Broadcasting Corporation, a Minneapolis-based entertainment conglomerate that owned the Harlem Globetrotters and the Ice Capades. The sale price was reportedly around $21 million, more than 3 times what AAA had paid 5 years earlier. This is one of those moments in the story that doesn't quite make sense until later. Why would a company whose business was basketball trick shots and ice skating shows want a small amusement park on a Canadian island accessible only by ferry? And why would AAA, which had just spent 5 years investing in the park, let it go? The answer to the second question seems to be simply that the offer was too large to refuse. The answer to the first question would become painfully clear within 3 years. IBC had no particular expertise in running an amusement park and less interest in the details that had kept Boblo going for decades. Reports later suggested that the company's sales staff didn't know anything about inner-city Detroit and that they had sold group packages without understanding the volatility of the market they were entering. By the 1990 season, the park was closing on Tuesdays to save money. Costs were mounting, attendance was soft, and the boats, always the park's lifeblood and its largest expense, were increasingly viewed by the new owners as a burden. In 1990, IBC announced that the steamers were too much to handle. The writing was on the wall, but the wall was on an island, and most people only saw it from a distance. The Joe Vitale Orchestra, which had played on both boats during the Browning years, entertaining guests as they danced the trip downriver and back, was a distant memory by then. The bands and the dancing had been replaced by recorded music, and eventually by nothing much at all. The boats in their final years were still beautiful from a distance, their white hulls and tiered decks cutting through the river, but up close the mahogany paneling that Lewis Keel had installed in 1902 had been painted over in places, the leaded glass was chipped, and the maintenance that kept a 100-year-old wooden superstructure intact was being deferred. Before the boat stopped running, there was the matter of the carousel. In early 1990, just 3 years after its painstaking restoration, the Mangels-Illions carousel was put up for auction. Not as a whole, piece by piece. Each hand-carved horse, each goat, each deer sold individually to the highest bidder. There was no one willing to buy the entire carousel and keep it intact. The animals fetched tens of thousands of dollars apiece. for a total of $860,000. Some accounts round the figure up to more than $1 million. The sale was controversial, mourned by preservationists and longtime visitors who saw the carousel as the park's soul. It had been there since 1906, the park's very first proper ride, the thing you passed on the way to everything else. And now it was in pieces, scattered to private collections. The platform where it had turned stood empty. What is particularly difficult to square is the timeline. The carousel was restored in 1987, sold in 1990, and the park wouldn't close for another 3 years. During those last 3 years, the space where the carousel had been was simply a gap, a visible absence in the middle of the park. One former employee recalled walking past the empty pavilion and feeling as though the park had already ended and just didn't know it yet. The summer of 1991 was the last for the Columbia and the St. Clair. Their final trip was September 2nd, 1991, ending 89 years of continuous service on the same route, a maritime record for an excursion steamship in the United States. The boats were sold as a pair in federal bankruptcy court in Minneapolis that November. IBC had declared bankruptcy. The park itself was put up for sale in February 1992 for $9 million, exactly half of what IBC had paid 4 years earlier. No firm offers came. Though one expert felt that Boblo was too big to fail outright and could be turned around, by June of 1992, no serious bidder had materialized. The park opened for the summer of 1992 anyway, but without the Detroit ferry service, reaching the island meant driving to Amherstburg or Gibraltar, Michigan, and catching a smaller boat. For generations of Detroiters, the boat ride from downtown had been the experience. Removing it was like selling the front door of a house and expecting people to climb in through a window. Attendance in 1992 fell well short of its goal, compounded by poor weather. With no buyers materializing, Norton Auctioneers of Coldwater, Michigan was retained to sell the property at auction on February 10, 1993. A Michigan-based group of investors won the bidding at $3.8 million. They planned to close the park and redevelop the island into a golf course, hotel, and condominiums. 2 days later, their $250,000 deposit check bounced. The bid was rejected. The runner-up, a contractor and commercial developer named Michael Mudenbaugh, who co-owned a Seattle amusement and water park, was declared the winner at $3.7 million. He planned to run the park for at least one more season under the name Enchanted Parks. The 1993 season was chaotic. There were disputes with island residents and with the Canadian Coast Guard. Maintenance was deferred. The atmosphere was threadbare. And then in September, Mudenbaugh was seriously injured in a car accident in Toledo, Ohio, breaking his spine. The park's operator was incapacitated just as the season was supposed to wind down. On September 30th, 1993, Boblo Island Amusement Park closed for what everyone suspected, and what proved to be the last time. It was 95 years old, 5 years short of its centennial. In March 1994, the remaining rides were dismantled and sold. The Screamer went to Playland in Vancouver, British Columbia, where it operated until 2018 under the name Corkscrew. It even appeared in a pivotal scene in the horror film Final Destination 3. The Skystreak roller coaster, formerly the Thunderbolt, was shipped to Selva Magica, a theme park in Mexico, where it was renamed Titan. Other rides went to parks in Texas and Maryland. The Falling Star, the Enterprise, the Wild Mouse, the Tilt-A-Whirl, the Dodgem cars, all dispersed. Malden Township officials watched the dismantling with particular dread. The amusement park had been paying 25% of the township's taxes. In 1994, a man named John Oram purchased the island site. Oram was an Iraqi immigrant to the United States who had made his money in the car stereo business. He proposed, vaguely, a casino and hotel. He then leased and shut down the White Sands Boaters hangout adjacent to the former park, citing trespassers. Boaters were furious. The lease was dropped within weeks. By late 1995, the site was being marketed for residential development. Townhouses and condominiums were proposed in 1997. The island was off-limits to non-residents until 2002. Not a single lot sold between the September 11th attacks and May 2004. With $19 million in debt, Oram's brother Randy forced Boblo Island into court-appointed receivership. Auditors from KPMG found there was no money left to continue supplying basic services to the island. Through all of this, the Sky Tower stood, 214 feet of steel, the tallest structure on the island, visible from the mainland, from the river, from passing freighters. It had been a ride that promised to show 3 states and a foreign country from a single rotating cabin. Now it was a monument to nothing in particular, its cabin long removed, its tower rusting. It stood through the bankruptcy, through the receivership, through the arrival of the next developer, Dominic Amicone, who took ownership in 2005 and began the long process of turning the island into a residential community. It stood through the housing slump that stalled construction. It stood while luxury homes and condominiums slowly rose around it, the old amusement park's geography rewritten into streets and driveways. The tower stood for 28 years after the park closed. On December 2nd, 2021, it was finally demolished, with the developer citing health and safety concerns. Meanwhile, the boats that had once defined the Boblo experience had their own afterlives. After the 1991 sale, the Columbia and the St. Clair were docked near the Great Lakes Steel Company in Ecorse, Michigan, exposed to the brutal Michigan winters with no shelter and no maintenance. They were auctioned again in foreclosure in 1996, and by 2000, both ships showed severe deterioration. Chipped paint, rotting wood, holes in the decks. In 2004, the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy had the Columbia shrink-wrapped in heavy plastic to slow the decay, but the plastic created a greenhouse effect that actually accelerated the rotting of the 100-year-old wood. The Conservancy eventually gave up its restoration plans in late 2005, citing budgetary constraints. Both ships had been designated National Historic Landmarks in 1992, the Columbia also being listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 1979. But landmark status does not come with a maintenance budget. In 2014, both ships were temporarily altered for the Michael Bay film Transformers: Age of Extinction, a strange footnote in which 2 of the most historic vessels on the Great Lakes were dressed up as props for a special effects blockbuster. That September, the Columbia was towed from Detroit to Toledo for dry docking, and then in 2015 to Buffalo, New York, where a nonprofit called the SS Columbia Project planned to restore her and operate her as a cultural venue on the Hudson River. The vision was appealing, the oldest surviving passenger steamer in America, sailing again. But by 2024, the project's website was offline. No updates had been posted since 2021, and local observers described the vessel as deteriorating at its berth on the Buffalo River. Estimates for a full restoration had climbed to between $10 and $12 million. The St. Clair fared worse. She was towed to various docks over the years, including a stint in Toledo, before ending up on the Rouge River near the Ford Rouge plant. On July 6, 2018, while docked at Riverside Marina on the Detroit River, she was engulfed in an accidental fire believed to have been caused by a welding mishap during early restoration work. The first calls came in at 11:45 in the morning. The blaze covered the entire length of the ship within 10 minutes. Firefighters battled it into the evening, but the historic mahogany woodwork and upper decks were destroyed. Days later, the steamer was considered a total loss. The boat's co-owner said afterward that the 110-year-old ship's steel skeleton had survived and could be rebuilt, but little progress followed. The St. Clair was delisted as a National Historic Landmark and removed from the National Register of Historic Places in 2023. There is something to sit with in that. The 2 boats that carried hundreds of thousands of people every summer, that had ballrooms and arcades and dance floors, that were designed by one of America's finest naval architects and decorated with leaded glass and gilded moldings, ended their lives rotting at industrial docks and burning at a marina. The boats were not extras in the Boblo story. For most visitors, the boats were the story. One former passenger, recalling childhood trips in the early 90s, said he remembered the boat rides more than the park itself, the anticipation of boarding, the arcade games on board, the views of the river. And then the boats were gone, and the park had 2 more years, and then the park was gone too. During the Vietnam War, the island had briefly served an unexpected purpose. Because Boblo sat in Canadian waters, reachable on an American ferry that didn't pass through formal customs, it became an efficient transit point for Americans seeking to avoid the draft. Canada had become a safe haven for those who refused to be drafted, and Boblo offered a way in without a border crossing. A young man could buy a ticket in Detroit, ride the Columbia or the St. Clair to the island, and upon arrival swap his return ticket with someone who had come over from Amherstburg on the Canadian side. The person from Canada would take the return trip to Detroit on the American boat. The draft resistor would take the return trip to Amherstburg on the Canadian ferry, arriving on the mainland of Ontario without ever passing through customs at the border. How many people used this route is impossible to know. That it happened at all is documented in historical accounts of the island. The amusement park, without intending to, had become a portal, an island that existed between two countries, technically in one but practically belonging to the other, turned out to be useful precisely because of that ambiguity. The same international status that the Boblo Excursion Company had tried to use as a shield against civil rights enforcement in 1948 was being exploited by draft resistors 20 years later for entirely different purposes. It is tempting to say that Boblo closed because of Cedar Point, or because of the boats, or because of bad owners, or because Detroit itself was struggling. Each of those things is a piece. Cedar Point was building world-class roller coasters, while Boblo was selling $8 all-day passes and hoping the charm would hold. The boats were magnificent and unsustainable, consuming nearly half the revenue while carrying the entire identity of the experience. The owners after the Browning family treated the park variously as a real estate play, a tax write-off, or a problem to be flipped. And Detroit's population and economic base were shrinking through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, reducing the customer base that had always been the park's foundation. But none of these alone was fatal. What killed Boblo was the speed at which they compounded once the ownership changed from people who cared about the park to people who saw it as an asset. Consider the timeline of ownership. The ferry company ran the park from 1898 to 1949. The Browning family ran it from 1949 to 1979. That is 81 years under two owners. Then from 1979 to 1993, the park changed hands 4 times. Cambridge Properties, AAA, IBC, and finally Moodenbaugh's Enchanted Parks. 4 owners in 14 years. Each transfer stripped away institutional knowledge. Each new owner arrived with a different plan, and each departure left debts and deferred maintenance for the next. Consider the carousel. Under the Brownings, it turned for 30 years. Under AAA, it was lovingly restored. Under IBC, within 2 years, it was dismantled and sold for parts. The same object, treated 3 completely different ways by 3 consecutive owners. The carousel didn't change. The people in charge did. After the park closed, there were people who tried to hold pieces of it in place. The blockhouse from the War of 1812 era survived, designated a National Historic Site. The lighthouse, built in 1836 and decommissioned in 1959 after its upper section was damaged by vandals who set fire to it in 1954, still partially stands. The dance hall, that enormous limestone building Henry Ford financed, remained on the island through all the ownership changes and is reportedly under consideration for repurposing by the current developer. The ferry dock on the island side stood even after the mainland dock in Amherstburg was demolished in July 2025, its removal prompting a wave of public reflection that surprised even those who had worked to preserve the park's memory. Former employees whose families had worked on Boblo for generations, grandmothers in the cafeteria, mothers on the rides, daughters in the ticket booths, talked about the island as though it were a place that had simply gone to sleep and might wake up. One former ride manager said the island played an important role in her life. She started as a ride operator and worked her way up through the last years before the closing. Another woman who worked on Boblo from the late 80s until the end said there was always a party on Friday nights, that it was just the place where everybody worked in the summer. The journey to get there was part of it. Riding a bike, then a bus, then a ferry, 2 hours each way, and doing it gladly. Today, the island has been transformed into a residential community developed by Amico Properties. There are roughly 150 homes, with over 200 additional lots sold for future construction. Residents reach the island by a private ferry from Amherstburg, a 5-minute crossing, a distance that once took 90 minutes aboard the Columbia from Detroit. The amusement park's geography has been mostly erased, scraped clean, and built over. But some remnants persist. The dance hall, the blockhouse, fragments of old foundations visible from certain angles, overgrown pathways that once connected the midway to the dock, an abandoned mini golf course slowly disappearing into the underbrush, the bumper cars pavilion, which may originally have been a dance pavilion, its limestone walls still standing. The developer has said the island will eventually reopen to some degree of public access once construction is further along, and has indicated plans to repurpose certain old buildings. The island is also, reportedly, home to the eastern fox snake, an endangered species whose presence created an awkward dynamic with developers. One explorer who visited the former park grounds recalled being told by the developer that he was free to look around, so long as he didn't take any photographs of snakes. The implication was clear. An endangered species on a development site was not something anyone wanted documented. There is a documentary about the Boblo boats narrated by Martha Reeves of Motown fame, in which the voice of the Columbia is given a speaking part, as though the ship itself were telling the story. There are collectors' markets where individual carousel horses from the 1906 Mangels-Illions set occasionally surface, each one appraised as a museum-quality artifact. There are people living in houses built where the Thunderbolt once rattled, and people in Buffalo watching a shrink-wrapped steamship slowly fall apart, and people in Mexico riding a roller coaster that used to overlook the Detroit River without knowing where it came from. The Screamer's afterlife in Vancouver is worth a small footnote of its own. After it was sold from Boblo and reinstalled at Playland as the Corkscrew, it operated for another 25 years before being retired in 2018. During those years, Vancouver's film industry used Playland as a frequent shooting location, and the coaster appeared in the background and foreground of dozens of movies and television shows, most notably as the setting for a death sequence in Final Destination 3. A ride that had been built for a small island park in the Detroit River ended up immortalized in a Hollywood horror franchise, which is the kind of afterlife nobody plans for. There is something unsettling about the dispersal of Boblo's rides. It is one thing for a park to close. It is another for its physical body to be divided and scattered across a continent. The carousel horses went to private collectors. The Screamer went to British Columbia. The Skystreak went to Mexico. Other rides went to Texas, Maryland, and the Pacific National Exhibition. Each piece continued to operate in its new home as though nothing had happened, spinning and dropping and rattling for new audiences who had no idea the ride had once sat on an island reachable only by steamship. The Nightmare, the Falling Star, the Enterprise, all found new homes or were scrapped for parts. Only the things too heavy or too old or too far gone to move stayed on the island, and even most of those were eventually removed. The Scootaboat Pond was drained. The log flume was dismantled. What remained was less a ruin than an absence. The ground scraped flat where structures had been, leaving oddly blank spaces that looked, from certain angles, as though the island itself had forgotten what used to be there. September 30th, 1993, was a Thursday. The weather that day in the lower Detroit River region was cool, the tail end of a troubled season. The last visitors walked through the gates knowing, or at least suspecting, that they were among the final ones. The rides ran. The midway was open, but the carousel pavilion had been empty for 3 years, its platform bare, the spot where 44 horses and 2 goats and 2 deer had turned since 1906, now just a flat circle of floor. The boats had been gone for 2 years. The island was reachable only from the Canadian side or from Gibraltar, Michigan, on smaller ferries that didn't have ballrooms or arcades or a man in a big hat telling knock-knock jokes. The Sky Tower still turned, 214 feet above the river, but the view from up there, if anyone rode it that last day, would have shown a park that was already thinning out, gaps where rides had been removed, buildings that needed paint, walkways that needed repair. It would have shown the river, wide and flat, and the Amherstburg shore, and somewhere beyond that, on the American side, the haze of Detroit, a city that had once sent steamships packed with 2,500 passengers at a time to this place. There was no ceremony, no last-day parade, no speech from a microphone. The gates closed. The lights went off. The island, which had been Wyandot farmland and a French mission, and a British fort, and a staging ground for war, and a recreation park and an amusement park, and the site of a landmark civil rights case, and a route for draft resistors, and a place where a man in a big hat told knock-knock jokes to children for 22 years, went dark. 5 years short of its 100th birthday. Workers at the park on that last day would go on to other jobs, other summers, other lives. Some of them, decades later, would drive to the Amherstburg shore and look across the narrow channel at the island, now dotted with the roof lines of luxury houses, and try to remember exactly where the Midway had been, where the Thunderbolt's first hill had risen, where the Scuda boats had bumped and sparked under their electric grid. The tower stood for 28 more years in the silence. Its steel frame turned orange with rust. Weeds grew through the platform where the carousel horses had turned. The dock where the Columbia and the St. Clair had unloaded their passengers weathered and sagged. And the river kept running, the way it always had, 18 miles from the city to the lake, past the island where the white trees had once grown.